The concrete was cold, but the blood was warm. That was the thing Sarah Calloway would remember most long after the broken ribs healed and the bruises faded from purple to yellow to nothing. Not the pain, which was extraordinary, not the fear, which was total, but the strange, terrible contrast of lying on freezing November asphalt with warmth spreading beneath her cheek, pooling from the cut above her eye, and the boy beneath her trembling like a struck bell, and the sound of footsteps splashing away through the rain until there was nothing left but the distant wail of a siren that was not coming any closer. She held on anyway. She held on until the boy stopped shaking. She held on until the alley was silent. She held on because letting go was simply not something she knew how to do. But that was later. That was the end of the beginning. To understand what happened in that alley behind Rust Creek High School on a Thursday evening in November, you have to go back to the town itself. You have to understand what kind of place produces that kind of darkness and what kind of woman walks into it with nothing but her own two hands and the absolute refusal to look away. Rust Creek, Pennsylvania did not die all at once. It died the way most American steel towns died, slowly, incrementally. One closed gate and one padlocked loading dock at a time, until the obituary had been written so gradually that nobody could quite remember when the living stopped. The Harwell Steel Plant, which had employed 1,100 men at its peak in 1978, shut its furnaces for the last time in the winter of 1994. The Consolidated Wire Mill followed in 1998. By the time the new century arrived, Rust Creek had lost 40% of its working population, and what remained was a particular kind of American grief, the grief of people who had done everything right and still lost everything anyway. The downtown had the hollowed look of a mouth missing its back teeth, storefronts with plywood where glass had been, a diner that changed ownership 4 times in 6 years and was now a check-cashing service, a hardware store that sold lottery tickets and not much hardware. The steeple of St. Michael's Catholic Church still rose above the tree line on the East Hill, but the congregation had thinned to a Wednesday morning handful of elderly women who prayed with the grim determination of people who had survived enough to believe prayer was the only reliable constant left. What filled the vacuum, as it always does in places where hope is extracted and nothing replaces it, was chemical comfort. Opioids moved through Rust Creek's remaining neighborhoods, the way water moves through cracked foundations, finding every weakness pooling in every low place. It came in the form of pills first, then powder, then in the last 3 years, the pale blue tablets pressed with the imprint of a pharmaceutical company that had nothing to do with their manufacture. Fentanyl, 40 times stronger than morphine. A product line controlled on the south side of Rust Creek by a 24-year-old man named Derek Kane, who drove a matte black Tahoe and wore a silver chain thick enough to anchor a small boat and had never in his life experienced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. But none of that was visible on the surface of things. On the surface, Rust Creek was just a tired town doing its best. Sarah Calloway had been doing her best in it for 6 years. She had come to Rust Creek High School at 28, fresh from her teaching certification and fired with the particular idealism of someone who has read enough history to believe that education is the one lever long enough to move the world. She had grown up in Harrisburg, studied English and history at Penn State, and turned down 2 better-paying positions in suburban Philadelphia because something about the listing for Rust Creek, the salary that was frankly embarrassing, the student-to-counselor ratio that bordered on the absurd, the single line that read, "high-need community," had spoken to some stubborn interior part of her that she had never quite been able to silence. 6 years later, she was still there. She was 34 now, and the idealism had been tempered by experience into something harder and more useful, something closer to conviction. She was not naive about what her students faced. She knew which ones weren't eating breakfast at home, and she kept a glass jar of granola bars in the bottom drawer of her desk without making any announcement about it because the kids who needed them most would not take them if taking them required admitting they needed them. She knew which ones had parents working double shifts and which ones had parents who were no longer reliably present in any meaningful sense. She stayed late on Tuesdays and Thursdays to help seniors with college application essays, Not because it was required, not because anyone was keeping track, but because for some of those kids, that hour and a half in her classroom was the only space in their entire week where someone was treating their future as a real and serious thing. She was a good teacher. She was probably, if anyone had been paying close attention, one of the best teachers Russ Creek High had seen in a decade. But in 6 years of watching students come through her door, she had never encountered one quite like the boy who sat in the back left corner of her seventh period history class. Leo Hargrove, 14 years old, small for his age with a mop of dark brown hair that always looked like he'd been riding with the windows down, and eyes the color of river stones, gray-green, and constantly moving, scanning the room with the watchful, measuring quality of an animal that has learned the hard way that stillness is safer than motion. He wore the same faded denim jacket to school every single day, regardless of the temperature the cuffs frayed. The collar turned up in a way that might have been stylish on someone who was trying to be stylish, but on Leo was simply practical, a way of making himself smaller, of reducing his visible surface area. What Sarah noticed first, before the jacket, before the eyes, before any of it, was his hands. Leo Hargrove had the hands of someone twice his age. The knuckles were prominent, the skin across them rough and reddened, and the creases of his palms and the beds of his fingernails were permanently stained with motor oil. Not the fresh black of someone who had been working that day, but the deep-set ground-in gray of someone who had been working for years. The oil had become part of him, the way calluses become part of a musician's fingers, the way a scar becomes part of skin. Those hands told a story that the rest of Leo's careful, closed-off exterior was working very hard not to tell. He never raised his hand in class. He never spoke to the other students. He was not hostile, not precisely, but he maintained a perimeter of solitude around himself that the other 14-year-olds seemed to respect with the instinctive social radar of the young. They did not bother Leo Hargrove because Leo Hargrove radiated something that made bothering him feel like a bad idea. Not danger exactly, but awareness. The sense that he saw everything and forgot nothing, and that his patience was not the patience of someone at ease, but the patience of someone waiting. What he did in the 50 minutes of seventh period history was draw. Not graffiti, not the idle, unconscious doodling that most bored students produced in the margins of their notes. Sarah had caught enough glimpses of his notebook over the week's stolen glances while she walked the rows during silent reading to understand that what Leo was producing was something else entirely. Schematics. Technical drawings rendered with a precision that had no business existing in the spiral notebook of a ninth grader. Detailed cross-sections of mechanical systems, gears and valves and cylinders laid out with the careful, exacting hand of someone who understood not just what these things looked like, but how they worked, why they worked, what would happen if you changed this measurement or adjusted that tolerance. The page she had seen most clearly on a Wednesday afternoon in late October had been a complete exploded diagram of a V-twin motorcycle engine, every component labeled in a small, cramped, but perfectly legible hand, every measurement notated. It was the kind of drawing that a professional mechanic might produce, that an engineering student might be proud of. It was sitting in the notebook of a boy who had not once in 8 weeks of school turned in a single completed assignment. 2 weeks before the night in the alley, Sarah began to notice the other pattern. The bell rang at 3:15. Every other student in seventh period treated the bell as a starting gun, chairs scraping backpacks, slamming the practice chaos of adolescence released from obligation. Leo did not move with them. He packed slowly, deliberately, one pencil at a time, aligning each item in his bag with a care that had nothing to do with tidiness and everything to do with delay. He waited. He waited until the hallway noise peaked and began to fade, until the buses outside groaned and pulled away, until the corridor outside room 204 had settled into the particular quiet of an emptied building. Then and only then did he stand up and leave. Sarah watched this happen on a Monday, then again on a Wednesday, then again the following Monday and Wednesday and Friday. 20 minutes, sometimes closer to 30, spent in methodical, performative slowness while the school emptied around him. She understood what she was seeing. She had been a teacher long enough to recognize the difference between a kid who dawdled because they were dreamy or disorganized, and a kid who dawdled because they were afraid of what was waiting for them outside. Leo Hargrove was not dreamy. Leo Hargrove was conducting a security operation. On a Tuesday in the first week of November, she tried speaking to him directly. He was at his desk arranging pencils, and she approached him the way she had learned to approach frightened things slowly with her hands visible without coming at him from above. She sat on the edge of the desk next to his, bringing herself to his level, and she said his name quietly. He flinched. The hand hovering over the notebook pressed down flat against it, covering the page. She told him she wasn't going to look. She told him she just wanted to ask if everything was okay at home. He looked up at her. For one unguarded second, the mask he wore slipped and she saw what was underneath it. Not sullenness, not teenage defiance. Fear. Pure, clean, exhausted fear, the kind that has been present for so long, it has stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like weather. Then the mask came back down. He said in a voice that was trying very hard to be flat and nearly succeeding, "You don't understand how things work around here, Ms. Calloway. If I tell you, it just gets worse. Just leave it alone." He picked up his bag and walked out, and Sarah stood in the empty classroom for a long moment, listening to the sound of his boots on the linoleum fading down the hall. She pulled up his school record that evening. It was sparse to the point of being nearly empty. No mother listed on the birth certificate. Father Michael Hargrove with a phone number that rang disconnected when she tried it at the start of the year. Address on the far south side of Rust Creek in the neighborhood that ran along the old rail yards. The part of town where, if you believe the rumors, certain organizations held sway over certain streets with more authority than the municipal government. No emergency contacts. No medical history beyond the standard immunization records. A boy who existed in the school's administrative system as barely more than a name and a seat number. Sarah closed her laptop and sat in the dark of her living room for a while, thinking about those hands. The oil that wouldn't wash out. The bruises on the knuckles that were always in some stage of healing, never fully gone, never fresh enough to suggest they were from a single incident. She thought about the way he scanned every room he entered, the way he sat with his back against walls. She made a decision. On Thursday of the following week, the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time that autumn, and the sky came down low and gray and released a cold, relentless rain that turned the school parking lot into a shallow lake by noon. Sarah came to seventh period that afternoon with a specific attention sharpened to a point. She graded papers. She did not look at Leo directly. She simply watched from the corner of her vision as he waited, as the classroom emptied, as the hallway quieted, as he finally stood, pulled his gray hood up over his denim jacket, and walked out without a word. She gave him a 10-second lead and followed. He did not go toward the front of the building, toward the buses and the parking lot and the main road. He turned left at the end of the corridor into the east wing, moving toward the automotive and metals workshop at the far end of the campus. This part of the building smelled of machine oil and sawdust, even in November, and the hallways here were narrower, the lighting older fluorescent tubes that buzzed at a frequency that made your back teeth ache. Sarah kept her footsteps soft, her rubber soles quiet on the linoleum, staying far enough back that she was around the corner whenever Leo glanced over his shoulder, which he did twice. He pushed through the heavy fire door at the end of the east wing, the one that opened onto the service path behind the automotive shop, and the cold air hit Sarah like a hand pressed flat against her face. She hesitated at the threshold, the rain immediately spotting her wool coat, then followed him through. The service path ran along the back of the school, separated from the alley beyond by a chain-link fence that had seen better decades. There was a gap in the fence near the dumpsters, a section where the chain link had been pulled free from the bottom post and bent back, creating a low opening just large enough for a person to duck through. Leo went through it without breaking stride, the practiced ease of someone who had used this specific exit many times. Sarah pushed through after him into the alley. It was narrow and dark, even in the late afternoon, shadowed by the back wall of an abandoned textile factory on one side and the school building on the other. The rain had collected in the broken asphalt, and the smell was rust and wet concrete and something chemical underneath industrial decay. She pressed herself against the damp brick of the factory wall and moved forward, her heart beginning to do something complicated in her chest. She heard the voices before she saw the men, not the high cracking voices of teenagers, low adult voices carrying the specific leisurely menace of people who are not worried about being overheard. She came around the edge of a dumpster and stopped. Leo was against the factory wall, his back flat against the brick, his chin up, his hands loose at his sides, and his face carrying that expression she had seen once in her classroom, the fear that had trained itself to look like something else. Standing in a loose semicircle around him were three men. The oldest was maybe 25. They were not students. They were not teachers. They were not anything that belonged in a school alley on a Thursday afternoon. The one in the center wore a heavy leather jacket over a dark hoodie, a silver chain at his throat thick enough to serve as ballast. He was lean in the way that suggested not fitness, but a metabolic acceleration that came from something chemical, the wiry, over-caffeinated leanness of someone whose body had been running hotter than it was designed to run for a long time. His jaw was sharp and his eyes were pale, and they held the particular flat quality of someone who had stopped finding anything surprising a while ago. Derek Kane. Sarah did not know his name yet. She would learn it later. But she recognized the type. She had grown up in a city large enough to produce that type, and 6 years in Rust Creek had given her enough context to place him immediately. This was not a man who was angry or agitated. This was a man who was comfortable. That was the most frightening thing about him. The comfort. He was speaking to Leo in a low conversational tone that was somehow worse than shouting. He said that Leo's father and his leather-wearing associates seemed to believe they had the standing to claim the southern docking area. He said that was a misunderstanding that needed to be corrected. He said that the most efficient way to correct misunderstandings of that nature was through the delivery of clear and tangible messages. One of the men flanking him moved forward and shoved Leo's shoulder hard, bouncing the boy off the brick wall. Leo's head cracked against the factory wall and he bit down on whatever sound tried to come out. Derek reached into the pocket of his jacket and produced a switchblade with the casual gesture of a man reaching for his car keys. The blade snapped open, and in the dim light of the alley, it caught the gray sky above and threw back a pale gleam. He pressed the flat of the blade against Leo's cheekbone. Leo closed his eyes, and something in Sarah Calloway came completely undone. She could not have articulated it afterward. She did not weigh outcomes. She did not calculate odds. She did not think about the 3 broken ribs that were coming, or the fractured cheekbone, or the concussion that would keep her hospital-bound for 3 days. She thought about nothing at all. She dropped her umbrella, stepped out from behind the dumpster, and walked toward the 3 men with the complete irrational authority of someone who has simply decided that this is not going to happen. She shouted. Her voice echoed off both brick walls and came back at her sounding larger than she expected. All 3 men turned. Derek lowered the knife slightly, narrowing his pale eyes at the woman walking toward him through the rain. He looked for a brief moment, genuinely confused. Then something settled back into place in his expression, and the flat comfort returned. Leo screamed her name. He told her to run. She kept walking. She told them she had called the police. She lied with complete conviction, her voice shaking, but her feet not stopping, moving herself directly between Derek Kane and the boy behind him. She said they were 2 minutes away. She said if they didn't leave immediately, all 3 of them were going to jail tonight. Derek laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. He glanced at the 2 men beside him with the easy amusement of someone watching a child do something precocious. He told her that the police in Rust Creek came when he called them, not the other way around. He told her in the friendly tone of someone explaining something obvious that she should turn around and walk away while she still had the ability to make that choice independently. His hand shot out. He grabbed a fistful of her hair and threw her. The asphalt came up fast and hit her like a solid thing, which it was. Her palms took some of the impact and both tore open on the gravel. Her knees hit next and her coat offered no protection worth mentioning. The air went out of her lungs in a single compressed rush, and she lay there for a moment that felt much longer than it was trying to remember how breathing worked. Leo yelled. She heard the sound of scuffling, heard one of the other men intercept him, heard the short, ugly sound of a fist hitting a body, heard Leo's breath leave him. She got her hands under her and pushed. The boot caught her in the ribs before she made it to her knees. The sound it made was a flat crack that she felt in her back teeth, and the pain that came with it was not sharp. It was total, a white detonation that went from her rib cage outward in every direction simultaneously. She curled forward, arms over her head, and braced. A second kick landed on her shoulder, wrenching it backward with a pop that she felt more than heard, something structural and wrong disconnecting in the joint. A third caught her in the jaw. She tasted copper. Her vision did something she had no reference for, a kind of fragmentation, the alley breaking apart into tiles and reassembling in the wrong order. She was on her side on the wet asphalt, and she could feel the cold of the concrete against her face and the warmth of her own blood spreading beneath her cheek. And somewhere close by, Leo was on his knees, and one of the other men was drawing his boot back. Sarah moved. She did not know how. She should not have been able to, but she pulled herself across 3 feet of wet gravel on her elbows and threw her body over the boy, locking her arms around him the way you lock a door, with everything she had, with her full weight and her remaining grip, and the absolute unreasoning conviction that she was not moving. The kick meant for Leo's ribs, connected with her spine. She pressed her face into Leo's denim jacket and held. More blows came. She absorbed them without releasing him. She had crossed some threshold someplace past ordinary pain, where the body simply processes incoming information without the usual editorial commentary, and she just held on, the way she had held on to difficult things her whole life. Students who were failing, and parents who were checked out, and a town that was slowly dying, and her own choice to stay in it, just held on because letting go was not in her. The siren was distant. It was not coming closer, but it was there. Derek Kane's voice, very close, very quiet, told Leo to relay a message to his father. 4 words, a name and a declaration, a family name and a statement of intent. Then footsteps, splashing, fading, then rain. Then the boy's hands on her face, small and trembling, and smelling of machine oil pressing against her bleeding cheek. His voice barely holding together, asking her not to be dead. "Please, Miss Calloway, please don't be dead." She told him she wasn't. She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she told him anyway. Then the dark came up around the edges of everything, and she let it. The smell of a hospital is a specific thing, bleach and iodine, and the particular staleness of recycled air, and it hit Sarah before she fully understood where she was. She surfaced slowly through layers of pharmaceutical distance, like rising through water that kept getting heavier the higher you went. There was a beeping. There was light that was too bright for a room this small. There was a pain in her chest that tightened every time she tried to draw a full breath. So she stopped trying to draw full breaths and took shallow ones instead, the way you learn to accommodate a limitation you can't fix yet. Her left eye was covered. She understood this by the darkness on that side. Her right eye opened to fluorescent lighting and a ceiling tile with a water stain in the shape of something she couldn't identify, and then lower, the plastic chair pulled to her bedside, and in it, Detective Voss. He was 50-ish, with the look of a man who had been handsome once and had since made a series of dietary decisions that had softened the angles of it into something blurred. He held a small notepad, and he was chewing a toothpick with the meditative patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. He welcomed her back to the living with an intonation that suggested he would have been equally comfortable had the situation gone the other way. He told her she had 3 broken ribs, a fractured cheekbone, a severe concussion, and a dislocated shoulder. She asked about Leo. He told her the Hargrove kid was fine. Bumps and bruises, released to his father a few hours ago. She asked him for a pen. She told him she could describe all 3 men. She told him she could identify Derek Kane by name, that she had seen his face clearly, that she was prepared to make a formal statement right now in this bed, whatever he needed. Detective Voss put his pen into his shirt pocket. He told her in the measured, patient tone of someone explaining something for the second time to a person who hadn't listened the first time that Russ Creek existed within a particular ecosystem. He told her that the Kane family operated on the east side and the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club operated on the south side, and that these two organizations had been in an armed territorial Cold War for approximately 14 months over distribution rights to the Southern Docking District. He told her that she, a civilian schoolteacher, had walked into the middle of this conflict wearing street clothes and no armor, and that the correct and advisable response was to classify her assault as an attack by unknown assailants in poor lighting and move on with her life. He leaned closer. He said that if she pressed charges, Derek Kane would make bail within the hour. He said that the Kane family had a long institutional memory and short tolerance for disrespect. He said he was telling her this for her own safety and that she should understand he was doing her a favor. Sarah looked at the detective for a long time. She told him to get out of her room. He told her he was trying to keep her alive. She told him to get out again, and the heart monitor beside her began beeping faster, and Voss stood up, tucked his notepad into his jacket, muttered something she didn't catch, and walked to the door. He let it click shut behind him. The room was very quiet. Sarah closed her right eye and lay in the thin dark behind her eyelids, and understood with a clarity that the painkillers couldn't blur exactly what had just happened. There was no investigation coming. There would be no arrest, no trial, no consequence for Derek Kane or the men who had been with him. The system that was supposed to adjudicate violence and establish accountability had just sat in the chair beside her bed and told her with great patience to accept what had been done to her and be grateful it wasn't worse. She had nearly died in a school alley protecting a student she barely knew, and the law was going to file that under paperwork that would never be opened again. For a little while, she simply lay there in the dark and felt the full weight of it. Then the atmosphere of the hallway outside changed. She heard it before she could make sense of it, a shift in the ambient noise of the ward, a lowering of voices at the nurse's station, and underneath that, the sound that grew slowly from the far end of the corridor. A rhythmic, heavy impact. Boots, but not the light, rubber-soled footsteps of hospital staff. These were hard-soled and deliberate, each step landing with the unhurried authority of someone who had never needed to move quietly because nothing had ever given them reason to. The door to her room opened. The man who came through it was the largest human being Sarah Calloway had seen outside of a television screen. He was at least 6'4", with shoulders that required him to turn slightly sideways through the door frame, and he moved with the contained, deliberate grace of something that has spent a long time learning to navigate a world built for smaller things. His beard was full and graying, his hair pulled back and secured, and his eyes were very dark, the color of river bottom. And they were taking in the room and everything in it with a quality of attention that was neither hostile nor warm, but simply absolute. He was wearing a leather cut over a heavy denim shirt. The patch on the left breast read President in capital letters. Sarah's heart monitor did something dramatic. She was aware of it distantly the way you're aware of weather through a window. The man raised one hand palm out in a gesture of such deliberate calm that it was somehow more authoritative than any aggressive posture could have been. He walked to the foot of her bed and stopped there, and he stood for a moment looking at her face, and the muscle in his jaw moved, ticking once, twice, like a clock maintaining time under pressure. Then he pulled the plastic chair around to the side of her bed, moving it with one hand as if it weighed nothing, and he sat down and he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and he said in a voice that was very deep and very quiet, "My name is Cole Hargrove. I'm Leo's father." Sarah said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. Cole Hargrove sat in the plastic chair beside her hospital bed and looked at the floor for a moment, and in that moment he looked not like the president of anything, but simply like a man carrying something very heavy. When he looked up again, his dark eyes held something Sarah had not expected to find in them. He told her that Leo had told him everything. The alley, the men, the knife. He told her that Leo had told him about a school teacher who weighed next to nothing, throwing herself over his son and absorbing boots that had been intended for the boy's skull. He said it in a voice stripped of ornamentation, just the facts as Leo had given them. But the facts were enough. They were more than enough. He reached into the inner pocket of his leather cut and placed a small black phone on the bedside table. He told her without any apparent emotion, but with complete certainty that the detective who had just left her room worked for the Kane family. He told her that the law in Rust Creek had been a subsidiary operation of the Kane distribution network for at least 5 years, which was why no one had come down that alley when she called. Not because they didn't know, because they had been told to let it happen. He told her that when she left this hospital, she would not be leaving alone. He stood up. He was an extraordinary physical presence in the small room, not threatening but overwhelming. The way a landscape can be overwhelming, something you have to adjust your perception to contain. He said that in his world, what a person did with their hands and their body in the critical moment was the only biography that mattered. He said she had written hers in a school alley in the rain at considerable personal cost, and that his club did not forget that kind of writing. He said the Hells Angels do not leave debts unpaid. He said keep the phone on you. When you're discharged, you call that number. From this moment forward, Miss Calloway, you are under the protection of the death head. He looked at her face one more time, taking in the gauze and the bruising and the stitches, with an expression that was not pity, but something older than pity, and more serious, something closer to reckoning. Then he put on his gloves, turned on his boots, and walked out of the room. The door closed. Sarah lay in the quiet and looked at the small black phone on the bedside table. Outside the window, the Pennsylvania night pressed against the glass, heavy and cold and indifferent. Inside the room, the heart monitor kept its steady patient count. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know about the black Tahoe that would crawl down Maple Street in the dark, or the man with the baseball bat, or the sound a motorcycle makes when it comes through a wooden fence at speed. She did not know about the bounty that would be placed on her head, or the 10 days of armed vigil on her front porch, or the morning when 90 engines would shake the frost from the trees on her street, and something she could not yet name would announce itself to the broken town of Rust Creek like a verdict. She knew only that she was alive when she had not expected to be, and that the boy was safe, and that something had begun in that alley that was not finished. She reached out with her good hand and touched the edge of the black phone. Then she closed her eye and let the painkillers pull her under into something that was almost, if not quite, rest. 3 days passed in the sealed artificial world of Rust Creek General before the attending physician signed her discharge papers. 3 days of fluorescent light that made no distinction between noon and midnight. 3 days of the heart monitor's patient arithmetic, counting out the seconds of her recovery with the indifferent precision of a machine that had no opinion about whether she deserved to heal. 3 days of meals that arrived on trays and were eaten or not eaten, depending on whether the pain medication had settled into something manageable, and phone calls she didn't answer from the school's main office. And one brief stilted voicemail from Principal Garrett that used the phrase, "take all the time you need," in a tone that made abundantly clear he hoped she would take a great deal of it. No detective came back. No officer arrived to take a formal statement. The investigation into the assault of Sarah Calloway English, an history teacher at Rust Creek High School, did not appear to exist in any operational sense. The world of official consequence had simply turned away from what had happened in that alley, the way a person turns away from something on the sidewalk they don't want to be responsible for stepping around. Sarah had expected this. Cole Hargrove had told her it would be this way, and he had not struck her as a man who said things he was uncertain about. On the third morning, a nurse with kind eyes and a Slavic accent helped her dress, easing her coat over the shoulder that had been wrenched back into its socket under anesthesia and still communicated its displeasure at every angle of movement. Sarah stood in front of the small bathroom mirror for a moment before they left the room. The woman looking back at her was recognizable but altered. The left side of her face carried a wash of color that moved from deep purple at the cheekbone, through violet, and into a sickly greenish yellow at the jaw, where the stitches pulled the skin together in a line that the surgeon had said would fade, but would not entirely disappear. Her left eye was open now, the gauze removed that morning, but it was still swollen enough that her field of vision on that side had the compressed underwater quality of looking through old glass. She studied this face for a moment with the detached attention of someone taking inventory. Then she buttoned her coat with her good hand, picked up her bag, and walked out. The nurse offered to call someone, asked if she had a ride. Sarah's hand went to her coat pocket before she consciously decided to put it there, her fingers finding the edge of the black phone Cole Hargrove had left on her bedside table. She stood with her hand in her pocket for a moment. Everything in her that had spent 34 years operating independently, solving problems with her own resources, refusing to require more from the world than she could reasonably expect it to give, pushed back against what the phone represented. She told the nurse she would take a cab. The cab ride through the gray November afternoon took 11 minutes. The driver did not make conversation, which she appreciated. She watched the familiar streets of Rust Creek move past the window, the check-cashing place where the hardware store had been, the diner that was now a payday loan office, the boarded storefronts along the east end of Main Street that had been boarded for so long the plywood had weathered to silver. She watched the town she had chosen 6 years ago with the full knowledge of what it was and felt something she could not quite name. Not regret, not fear exactly, but the particular weight of a place that asks more of the people who love it than most places have any right to ask. Her duplex on Maple Street looked the same as she had left it. This struck her as faintly absurd. She had nearly died less than a mile from this front porch, and the porch looked exactly as it always looked. The wooden railing she had been meaning to repaint since September, the clay pot with the dead geranium she had also been meaning to address since September, the welcome mat that said, "Welcome" in letters rubbed nearly flat by 2 years of winter boots. She paid the driver and got out. The air was bitter, edging toward the kind of cold that meant the first real snow was no longer theoretical. Her breath came out in small white clouds that dissolved immediately in the wind. She moved up the concrete walk with the careful, tilted gait of someone whose rib cage has opinions about every step, and she was 3 feet from the porch steps when she became aware of the car. She heard it before she saw it, or rather she felt the absence of something that should have been there. The sound a car makes when it is moving at normal residential speed, the particular Doppler quality of an engine passing through. What she felt instead was a presence that was not moving, a sustained idling hum at the periphery of her awareness. She turned. The Tahoe was matte black, the same flat, light-absorbing black as the vehicle that had been described to her by the part of her brain that had been cataloging threat information since childhood. It was parked 50 feet down Maple Street, with its headlights off, its engine running at the low, patient idle of something that is waiting rather than arriving. The windows were tinted past the point where you could identify anything inside. For 3 full seconds, Sarah stood on her front walk and looked at the Tahoe, and the Tahoe sat in the dark of the early evening and did nothing. Then the driver's door opened. The man who got out was heavy-set, his face lost in the hood of a dark sweatshirt. He moved around the front of the vehicle with no urgency at all, the unhurried gait of someone performing a task they have performed before. The passenger door opened and a second man emerged, and this one reached into the back seat and produced something that caught the amber light of the nearest street lamp, a metal baseball bat held loosely swinging at his side. The way a person might carry an umbrella on a day when rain is possible but not certain. They were not running, they were walking. Walking was worse. Sarah's hand was already in her pocket. She did not remember putting it there. Her fingers found the black phone, and her thumb found the only number saved in it, and pressed call, and the line opened on the first ring, not the second. The first, as if someone had been holding the phone waiting. A voice she didn't recognize, low and unhurried, spoke 2 words, "Talk fast." She said there were 2 men on her lawn with a bat in a car she had seen before, and she couldn't get her keys in the lock. The voice said, "Get inside, lock the deadbolt, get down on the floor." She said, "I can't get inside, I dropped my keys, they're on the porch." A pause of less than 2 seconds. Then get to the porch. Stay low. We are already moving. The 2 men from the Tahoe had reached the end of her front walk. They were still not running. The one with the bat was rolling it in a slow, deliberate arc, wrist loose, casual, the performance of someone who wants you to understand that they have done this before and found it unremarkable. Sarah moved. She crossed the remaining distance to the porch steps in a scrambling sideways motion that sent a bright, specific objection through her rib cage, and she went to her knees on the wooden boards, sweeping her hand across the planks, where she had heard the keys land when she dropped them, and her fingers found the cold metal, and she had the key in the lock when she heard it. Not from down the street, not from around the corner, from directly beside the house, from the narrow side yard that ran between her duplex and the vacant lot next to it, a sound that was not a sound so much as a physical event. A detonation of mechanical noise that arrived without preamble, a full-throated engine roar that seemed to compress the air and push it outward in all directions simultaneously. The wooden fence along the side yard exploded inward. Planks splintered and flew. A section of the fence that had stood for years simply ceased to exist as a coherent structure in the span of a half-second, and through the gap and over the remains of it came a motorcycle. A massive dark custom machine moving at a speed that had no business being achieved in a residential side yard. And the rider did not brake, did not slow, came off the sidewalk curb and crossed the front lawn and brought the bike to a controlled, sideways stop directly between Sarah's porch and the two men on her walkway. The bike's front wheel was 18 inches from the chest of the man with the bat. The rider sat for one moment in the sudden silence left by the cut engine steam rising from the exhaust pipes into the cold air. Then he swung his leg off the bike and stood up. He was enormous. Not Cole Hargrove enormous, not that particular mountain range quality, but large in the specific functional way of someone who has spent a long time doing physical work in difficult conditions, wide through the chest and shoulders, his neck thick, his hands the size of small shovels. He wore a leather cut over a gray thermal shirt, and on the left breast of the cut was a patch that Sarah would later learn read, Sergeant at Arms. His face was heavily bearded, weathered to the texture of old leather itself, and his expression was one of such complete and absolute calm that it was more frightening than rage would have been. This was Rourke. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it the next morning when he was still sitting on her porch in a folding chair he had produced from somewhere, drinking black coffee from a thermos, watching the street with the patient, comprehensive attention of a man on watch. Rourke reached back over his right shoulder with a motion so practiced it had the quality of reflex rather than intention, and his hand closed around the stock of the weapon secured in the leather scabbard strapped diagonally across his back, and he drew it in a single fluid movement, and the sound of the pump action cycling a shell into the chamber of the shotgun was a sound that had no ambiguity in it whatsoever. It was a sound that meant exactly one thing clearly in any language. The man with the bat let it fall. It rang against the frozen ground with a sound like a small bell. His companion had already taken 2 steps backward, and now both of them were moving in the focused, purposeful way of men who have just recalculated something important and arrived at a different conclusion than the one they had started with. They reached the Tahoe in seconds. The doors slammed. The engine revved and the vehicle pulled out hard tires, cutting against the cold asphalt, and it went down Maple Street and turned at the end and was gone. Rourke lowered the shotgun. He stood for a moment on the front lawn, watching the direction the Tahoe had gone, the way a dog watches a fence after a threat, has passed it attentive and patient, and prepared to be wrong about it being over. Then he turned, came up the porch steps, picked up her keys from where she had dropped them again. At some point she hadn't registered, unlocked the front door and pushed it open. He stepped to the side. He said in a voice like gravel settling, "You should get in out of the cold, ma'am. I'll be on the porch. Nobody else is coming up these steps tonight." Sarah looked at this man, this enormous, quiet-armed stranger on her front porch, and understood that the choice she had made in the hospital, the cab instead of the phone call, the independence, instead of the help, had been a choice made by a version of herself that had not yet fully understood what she was standing in the middle of. She went inside. She locked the deadbolt. Outside, she heard the scrape of the folding chair being set up and the small sound of a thermos being opened, and then nothing but the wind in the maple trees along the street, and the knowledge that someone was out there watching, and the complicated, unfamiliar feeling of being guarded by someone who had no institutional obligation to do so. The next 10 days had a rhythm that Sarah had not anticipated. She had expected siege. She had expected the constant, pressing anxiety of a person who knows they are being hunted. the hypervigilance that doesn't allow sleep, the way threat rewires your attention until you can't look at a closed door without imagining what's behind it. And that was present. She would not pretend otherwise. She woke in the night sometimes suddenly and completely listening to the house, and she had to talk herself through what she heard: the settling of old wood, the furnace cycling on Rourke or Carver, shifting in the folding chair on the porch, the sound of a car on the cross street 3 blocks away. That wasn't the Tahoe, wasn't anything, was just a car. But she also healed. The body is relentless in its insistence on repair, and her body, despite everything she had put it through, was no exception. The sharp white agony of the broken ribs softened by degrees into something that was still significant, but no longer total, that could be worked around and breathed through, and even carefully slept through. The swelling in her face continued its slow retreat. By the 5th day, she could open her left eye fully, and the world on that side, which had been compressed and slightly wrong for almost 2 weeks, snapped back into ordinary clarity. She graded papers from the couch. She answered student emails. She put together lesson plans for the substitute who had been brought in for her classes. And she did this with the particular focused attention of someone who needs to believe that the normal structure of their life still exists and is worth maintaining. On the 5th day, she found the drawing. She almost missed it. She went out to get the morning paper from the porch, moving carefully in the cold, nodding to Carver, who was in the chair that morning, and on her way back inside, she glanced down and saw the folded piece of paper wedged under the edge of the welcome mat. It was a page torn from a spiral notebook. She unfolded it, standing in the doorway, and inside was a drawing pencil on lined paper, executed with that unmistakable precision she had come to associate with the boy who sat in the back left corner of 7th period. It was a mechanical drawing, not the V-twin engine she had glimpsed before, but something new, a different configuration, a design she thought might be partially original, rather than copied from reference, with annotations in that small, exact hand. In the bottom right corner, in letters slightly larger than the rest, were 3 words: "I am sorry." No name, no explanation, no knock on the door, no ring of the bell. He had come to her house, this 14-year-old boy with oil-stained hands, and left this on her mat and walked away before she could answer. Sarah stood in her doorway in the cold for a long moment, holding the paper. She understood. He was saying thank you in the only language he had fully developed, the language of precision and mechanical understanding, the language of things that could be drawn and measured and made to work correctly. He was saying, "I am sorry," in the way people say it when they mean something larger than the words themselves, when they mean, "I am sorry that you are in this because of me. I am sorry that doing the right thing cost you this much. I am sorry that my life has this gravity to it." She brought the drawing inside and put it on the kitchen table and looked at it while she drank her coffee. On the 10th day, Cole Hargrove knocked on her door. She knew it was him before she answered. Not because of the sound of a motorcycle. There wasn't one. He had come in a truck. She had heard it park. She knew it because of the quality of the knock itself, 3 solid impacts that were neither hesitant nor aggressive, but simply certain, the knock of someone who is accustomed to being the person whose arrival matters. He was wearing a black thermal shirt and dark jeans, no club cut, and without the full regalia of the leather and the patches, he looked, if not smaller, then at least more human in scale. His face was the same, the thick graying beard, the dark eyes that missed nothing, the jaw that held it set even when the rest of him was at rest. He had something under his arm, a photograph in a plain frame, a thing so domestic and incongruous in his hands that it took Sarah a moment to process what she was seeing. She let him in without asking why he'd come. There was no version of this conversation that needed to happen on the porch. He sat at her kitchen table. He didn't want coffee, said so without elaboration. He set the photograph on the table facing her and sat with his hands folded in front of him, looking at the tabletop. The photograph was of a child, 7 years old, maybe, or 8. Dark hair, river-stone eyes, a face caught in that specific unconsciousness of deep sleep, the complete muscular surrender of a child who has no anxiety about where they are. The child was curled in the seat of a motorcycle, a large chrome-laden machine that dwarfed him entirely. his cheek pressed against the leather of the seat, one small hand resting on the fuel tank. The hand, even in sleep, even at 7 years old, showed the beginning of the staining that would become permanent. Cole Hargrove said, "That's Leo. In my garage maybe 7 years ago. He used to fall asleep in the shop. Didn't matter what time I sent him to bed, I'd come in at midnight and find him like that, curled up on whichever bike I was working on. Said the smell of the oil helped him sleep." He stopped. His jaw worked once. He said when they brought Leo to the hospital the night of the alley, the doctor told me the bruises on his ribs were old. Not from that night. Old. 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks old. He had a healed contusion on his left forearm that the doctor said was consistent with a defensive injury. He said this without inflection in the same flat, certain voice he used for everything. And Sarah understood that the flatness was not absence of feeling, but the opposite, that it was the structure you build when the feeling is too large to allow any movement, any fluctuation, because if it moves at all, it will take everything else with it. He said Derek Kane's crew had been putting hands on my son for at least 6 weeks before that night, sending messages to me through my boy. And I did not know. I was not there. I thought keeping Leo out of the life meant keeping him away from the club, away from the business, away from all of it. I thought the separation was protection. He stopped again. Sarah did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would be adequate, and she had enough experience with grief, the quiet, particular grief of people who are not practiced at showing it, to know that what Cole Hargrove needed in this moment was not a response. He needed a witness. He needed someone to sit across the table and not look away while he carried this. She got up, filled a mug, and set it in front of him without asking again whether he wanted it. He did not drink it, but his hands moved to it, wrapping around the ceramic, and she thought that was probably what she had meant him to have. She sat back down. After a while, he looked up. The thing that had moved in his face in those few moments settled back into its customary arrangement, and Cole Hargrove was once again the president of a motorcycle club that had chapters in 3 states and a reputation that preceded it by a considerable distance. But something remained in his eyes that hadn't been there the first time she'd seen him. Something that knew her now in a different way. He said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly." She said she was listening. He said, "Derek Kane placed a bounty on your life this afternoon. $10,000. He can't reach me directly, and hitting a club officer brings consequences that even the Kane family isn't prepared to absorb right now. So he's going sideways. He's going after you to send a message. And because you made his crew look weak in that alley, and because men like Derek Kane cannot tolerate the existence of something they can't control or frighten, you specifically represent something that offends him at a fundamental level." He let her sit with that for a moment. Then he said, "There is a cabin in the Adirondacks. It belongs to the club. There's a caretaker, heat, running water, a pantry that gets stocked twice a month. I can have you there by tomorrow morning. You stay until this is finished. When the war with the Canes is done, and done completely, you come home." He was watching her with the direct, measuring attention he brought to everything. Sarah looked at the photograph of the sleeping child on the table between them. She looked at the drawn page from Leo's notebook, which was still on the table where she had set it that morning next to her coffee cup, and the school papers she had been grading. She thought about her classroom. She thought about the specific faces in her 7th period class. Not Leo, the others, the ones whose names she knew, and whose situations she knew, and whose futures she had been treating stubbornly and sometimes against all evidence as real and serious and worth the investment of her time. She had lain on her couch for 10 days healing thinking. The thinking had not stopped, had not given her any peace or resolution, had simply continued the way thinking does when you have given it something it considers important. And somewhere in those 10 days, underneath the fear and the pain and the stark, unambiguous vulnerability of knowing that a man with resources had decided she should not continue to exist, something had clarified. She said no. Cole Hargrove's expression did not change, but something in the quality of his attention shifted. He was listening now with a different kind of focus. She said, "I have been a teacher in this town for 6 years. My students have nothing. Most of them have written off the possibility of anything beyond what they can see right in front of them, which is not much. They have watched this town lose everything, and they have drawn the conclusion that this is simply how things are, that the strong take what they want and the rest manage as best they can, and nobody who tries to do something different survives the attempt. She said, if I get in a truck tomorrow morning and disappear into the mountains because Derek Kane put a price on my head, that is the lesson I teach them. Not in my classroom, in the actual world they live in. The lesson that doing the right thing is not something you can afford to do consistently, that the moment it costs you something real, you fold. She said, I will not teach him that. I will not give Derek Kane my classroom. I'm going to work on Monday. She had not planned to say that last part. It arrived fully formed, and she understood as she said it, that she had known it for some time, that it had been the destination of 10 days of thinking, and she had only just arrived at it out loud. The kitchen was very quiet. The furnace hummed. Outside on the porch, Rourke's chair creaked as he shifted his weight. Cole Hargrove looked at Sarah Calloway across her kitchen table at the stitches on her jaw and the healing bruise on her cheekbone, and the way she was sitting with her spine exactly straight, because leaning required her rib cage to compromise, and her rib cage had not finished healing, and she was not going to show that it hadn't. He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He did not say anything else to her. He pressed a number and lifted the phone to his ear, and when it connected, he said without preamble, "Get on the phone with Dayton in Morgantown. Tell them we ride at 4 in the morning. Tell everybody in Rust Creek to fuel up tonight and be at the yard by dawn. We're taking the teacher to school." He ended the call. He put the phone back in his pocket and stood up from her kitchen table, and in standing, he returned fully to the scale of himself, the size that made her kitchen feel like a space that had been designed for different requirements. He looked at her one more time. He said, "Be on your porch at 7. Don't be late." He walked to her front door and let himself out, and through the kitchen window. She watched the truck pull away from the curb and move down Maple Street under the amber wash of the streetlights. Sarah sat at her kitchen table in the quiet. She picked up Leo's drawing and looked at it again, at the precise mechanical lines, the careful annotations, the 3 words in the corner. She thought about a small boy, asleep in a garage, one hand on a fuel tank, learning the smell of motor oil before he learned most other things. She thought about Monday morning. Outside, the temperature dropped another 2 degrees, and the sky over Rust Creek went the color of iron, and somewhere in the distance, too far to hear, but close enough to feel in the way you sometimes feel things before they arrive, something was being set in motion that would not be quiet. She put the drawing down. She went to the window and looked out at the street, at Rourke's silhouette on the porch, at the maple trees, stripped bare by November, their branches making complicated patterns against the darkening sky. She thought Monday. Then she went to her bedroom, moving carefully, and began for the first time in 10 days to plan what she was going to teach. She did not sleep. She had intended to. She had gone to bed at 10 with a deliberate practical intention of someone who understands that what is coming will require everything they have, and that everything they have is currently running on deficit. She had lain in the dark and listened to the house and told herself in the patient internal voice she used with students who were resisting something they needed that sleep was not optional, that the body has requirements that cannot be indefinitely negotiated away, that she had a long day ahead of her and she would face it better rested than exhausted. Her body listened politely and then did not sleep. She lay on her back with her hands folded on her stomach and stared at the ceiling and thought about her classroom. She thought about the specific geography of it, the way the afternoon light came through the west-facing windows in the last period of the day and fell across the rows of desks in long angled bars that moved slowly as the hour progressed. She thought about the board, the particular quality of chalk on that specific slate, the way you had to hold it at a certain angle or it squealed. She thought about the jar of granola bars in the bottom drawer and whether she had enough left or whether she needed to stop at the gas station on the way in. She thought about Leo's face in that alley, the moment before she stepped out from behind the dumpster. His eyes closed, his head turned away from the blade, the complete devastating resignation of a child who has run out of options and knows it. At 4:30 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and got up. She showered carefully, working around the shoulder that still had opinions about certain ranges of motion, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror with the same inventorying attention she had brought to it in the hospital. The bruise on her cheekbone had moved through its full spectrum and settled now into a faded yellowish stain that foundation could mostly cover. The stitches on her jaw had been removed 2 days ago, and the scar was thin and pale, something you would notice only if you were looking for it. She decided like herself again, tired and altered in some way she couldn't quite measure but herself. She put on her gray dress, the one she wore on the first day of every school year, because it was professional without being formal, approachable without being casual. The wool cardigan over it charcoal. Her good boots, the ones with the low heel that she could stand in for 6 hours without significant complaint. She made coffee and drank it standing at the kitchen window watching the street below, which was empty and dark and very cold. At 6:15, Rourke knocked on the door. He did not come in. He simply stood on the porch when she opened it and looked at her for a moment and said, "You should eat something." She said she wasn't hungry. He said eat something anyway. She went back inside and made toast and ate it standing over the kitchen sink. And when she came back to the porch with her satchel over her shoulder and her coat buttoned, Rourke was still there, and his expression, which was not a communicative expression, under the best circumstances, held something that she thought might be in the particular emotional dialect of a man like Rourke, the equivalent of approval. They stood on the porch together in the dark and the cold and waited. At 6:40, Sarah felt it. She felt it before she heard it, which was the thing people always mention afterward when they tried to describe that morning the way it arrived in the body. First, a low vibration that came up through the soles of her boots and moved through the wood of the porch floor and registered in the bones of her feet as something between a sound and a pressure. The maple trees on the street, stripped bare and brittle in the November cold, trembled very slightly. A puddle left by last night's frost melt began to show concentric rings on its surface, expanding outward from no visible source. Then the sound arrived. It came from the west end of Maple Street. First, a low, sustained thunder that grew not louder so much as denser, building in register and complexity as more sources joined it, each engine adding its particular voice to a collective sound that had stopped being a collection of individual machines and become something else entirely, something that had its own presence, its own weight, that pressed against the chest and resonated in the sternum. Rourke stepped off the porch onto the front walk and stood there looking west. Sarah came down the steps and stood beside him. The first headlight appeared at the end of Maple Street, then the second running beside it, and then the third and fourth, each pair emerging from the pre-dawn dark in perfect lateral formation, and behind them more and behind those more, still a column of light that went back further than she could see in the November dark, turning the corner from the main road in a river of chrome and amber that did not stop coming. Cole Hargrove was at the head of it. She recognized him before she could have said specifically what she recognized, the particular way he occupied a motorcycle, the quality of stillness he maintained at whatever speed he was traveling, as if the machine was an extension of his own body and required no conscious management. His bike was large and dark, and the exhaust pipes threw twin plumes of white vapor into the cold air as he came down Maple Street, and everything came with him. The full consequence of the phone calls he had made from her kitchen table the night before. They came two abreast. The formation was precise, the spacing between pairs maintained with a consistency that spoke of long practice, of many miles ridden in exactly this configuration. The engines were not synchronized, each one running at its own frequency, its own timbre, but together they created a sound that was not cacophony, but something closer to a chord, a mechanical harmony that was simultaneously beautiful and deeply fundamentally serious. Sarah counted. She stopped counting at 60 because Cole was pulling up in front of her house, and what she was feeling required her full attention. He brought the bike to a stop at the end of her front walk and put a boot down on the frozen ground and looked at her. Behind him, the column continued to move, bikes peeling off to line the street on both sides, engines idling, the collective sound dropping to a sustained, patient rumble that she felt in her teeth. He reached behind him to the luggage and unclipped something and tossed it toward her in a single unhurried motion. She caught it. It was a leather vest. A cut, she now knew the word for it. It was heavier than she expected, the leather thick and broken in smelling of cold air and road miles and motor oil, a smell she had come to associate over the past 10 days with the presence of people who had stood between her and something worse. It had no club patches on it. On the left breast, stitched in white thread block letters, "Protected." Cole said, "Put it on." She put it on over her cardigan. It was too large, the shoulders wide past her own, the hem reaching her hips, but the weight of it settled around her like something deliberate, like something that meant what it said. Cole patted the seat behind him. Sarah Calloway walked across her frost-covered front lawn to the motorcycle idling at her curb, swung her leg over the seat with the care her ribs still required, and settled in behind the president of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club Russ Creek chapter, with her leather satchel across her body and her good boots on the foot pegs. Cole raised his right fist above his head. The signal moved backward through the column like a current through water, and 90 engines responded, the collective sound rising from a rumble into something that was no longer a sound, but a physical condition, a weather system, a fact about the immediate world. He said over his shoulder without turning his head, "Hold on, Ms. Calloway." She put her hands on either side of his leather cut and held on. The column moved. The ride through Russ Creek at 7 in the morning on a Thursday in November was 4 miles and 11 minutes, and Sarah understood even while it was happening that she would spend the rest of her life trying to accurately describe it and never quite managing to. The town looked different from the back of a motorcycle at the head of a 90 bike formation. Or perhaps the town was different for those 11 minutes, actually different in some measurable way. The sound preceded them, clearing the road of ordinary traffic the way a siren clears it, but without the urgency of emergency, with something more like the commanded authority of a procession. People stopped on sidewalks. A man walking his dog on the main road stopped, and the dog sat without being told. A woman in a parked car sat with her hands on the steering wheel and turned her head as they passed and did not look away. They came along the main road, past the Eastern Commercial Strip, past the check cashing place, and the lottery ticket hardware store, and the shuttered storefronts with their weathered plywood. They came past the St. Michael's steeple on the East Hill. They came past the precinct. The precinct. Cole did not slow down, but he did not look away from it either, and Sarah looked with him. 2 patrol cars were in the lot, and 2 officers were outside them, standing with coffee cups, having the particular aimless morning conversation of people whose shift had just started and had not yet required them to do anything. They heard the column coming from 2 blocks away, which gave them time to register the scale of it before it arrived. And Sarah watched their faces as the motorcycles went past, watched the coffee cups lower, watched the professional composure give way by degrees to something that was less certain of itself. Voss was the one on the left. She recognized him by his posture, that particular combination of self-importance and fundamental smallness. And she watched him, watched the column go past, watched his face do something complicated, and then go carefully blank. And she felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite forgiveness, but was somewhere in the territory between them, a complex emotional settlement that she suspected would take years to fully understand. Cole did not look at Voss, but the column did not hurry past the precinct. It maintained exactly its pace, deliberate, unhurried, occupying the street with the full weight of its presence. They crested the hill above Russ Creek High at 7:23. The school below was doing what it always did at this hour. The loosely organized morning arrival buses pulling into the loop, students moving across the parking lot in the slow, gravitationally reluctant way of teenagers before 8 in the morning. The faculty lot to the left of the main building showed the usual scattering of cars, sedans, and hatchbacks, and one ancient pickup that belonged to the shop teacher. And positioned in front of the main entrance, arranged with a deliberateness that declared its purpose, was the matte black Tahoe. Flanking it on either side were 2 older sedans, dark-colored, their engines running. There were 6 men distributed among the 3 vehicles, some leaning against hoods, some standing with their hands in jacket pockets, in the way that hands are kept in pockets when the jacket pockets contain things that are not hands. They were not students, and they were not faculty, and their presence in a school parking lot at 7:23 in the morning had exactly one explanation. They were waiting for a small Honda Civic with a specific license plate. They were waiting for the end of a $10,000 problem. Cole saw them at the same moment Sarah did. She felt it in the quality of his stillness, a stillness that deepened rather than changed the way water deepens when you move from the shallows over a drop. He did not slow down. He gunned the throttle. The column descended into the school parking lot, not with the gradual, cautious approach of visitors, but with the absolute directional certainty of people who have decided something and are in the process of executing that decision. The sound of 90 engines in an enclosed parking lot was a different thing than 90 engines on an open road. It was total. It filled every cubic inch of the space and pressed outward against the brick walls of the school building and came back off them as echo, doubling itself, creating a sound environment that was not a sound so much as a redefinition of the immediate physical reality. The 6 men by the Tahoe did not understand what was happening for approximately 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Sarah watched understanding move across their faces in sequence. First, the sound registered too large for the space wrong in its scale. Then they turned and saw the column entering the lot from the main entrance. Then they saw the size of it, bikes still coming through the gate, the column not ending, not stopping, and the leading edge of it not slowing or diverting, but coming directly and without apology toward them. One of the men reached for his waistband. Derek Kane stepped out of the passenger side of the Tahoe and put his hand on the man's arm. Sarah saw this from 40 feet away. She saw Derek's face in the moment he understood what he was looking at. She had seen Derek Kane's face once before at close range in a dark alley with a knife in his hand, and on that face she had seen the comfortable, flat authority of someone who has not encountered a limit to what he can do. She wanted to see that face now, and she looked at it, and what she saw instead was a man who had found the limit. Cole brought the bike to a stop 12 feet from the front bumper of the Tahoe and put a boot down and killed the engine, and behind him the column spread through the parking lot with the organic efficiency of something that has practiced this. Bikes moving to positions that created a perimeter around the 3 vehicles, and the 6 men, not aggressive, not threatening in any explicit way, just present, comprehensively and inescapably present, until the Tahoe and the sedans were inside a circle of machines and riders that had no gap in it large enough to be called an exit. Then one by one, the engines cut. It did not happen all at once. It moved through the lot in a wave, ignition after ignition, going silent, the sound diminishing in stages until the last engine cut, and the parking lot of Rust Creek High School was quiet, in a way that parking lots are almost never quiet, a quality of silence that had substance, that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of held breath. 90 men sat on their machines and did not speak. Cole got off his bike. He did not draw anything. He did not raise his voice. He walked the 12 feet between his front wheel and the Tahoe's bumper with his hands loose at his sides and his shoulders level, and he stopped when he was close enough to the vehicle that a man of average height would have felt crowded, which Derek Kane was. And he stood there and looked at the man who had put a price on a schoolteacher's life. Sarah slid off the back of the bike. She was shaking. She acknowledged this to herself with the same directness she tried to bring to most things. Yes, she was shaking her hands and her knees, and somewhere deep in the core of her, where the broken ribs had knitted themselves back together but still knew they had been broken. She was shaking and her jaw ached from the cold, and there were 90 motorcycles in a circle around her, and a man who wanted her dead was standing 20 feet away. She straightened her spine, squared her shoulders, lifted her chin. The leather cut with its white stitching sat on her like it had been made for her, which it hadn't, which somehow made it matter more. She walked toward the school entrance. Not toward the confrontation, not toward Derek Kane, not toward the circle of machines. Toward the front door of Rust Creek High School, directly without deviation, The way she had walked into this building every morning for 6 years, carrying her satchel on her shoulder, with the same collection of papers she had graded last night from her couch. The papers she had stacked and banded and put in the front pocket because she would need to return them today, and she had been meaning to return them for 2 weeks. She heard Cole's voice behind her, quiet enough that it was almost private, but positioned to carry to Derek Kane with perfect clarity. He said, "I understand you've had some business with the school faculty." She did not hear Derek respond. Cole said, "This building is neutral ground. Every student in there goes home at the end of the day in exactly the condition they arrived. Any business the Kane family imagines it has with anything on this street or within sight of this building is concluded as of this morning." A pause. Cole said, "Ms. Calloway teaches here. That is going forward the only thing you need to know about this location. You don't drive past it. You don't have people who drive past it. If I hear a Kane car idling within 2 blocks of the school on a school day, I will consider that a statement of intent, and I will respond accordingly." Another pause. Cole's voice dropped one register, and at this lower register, it lost nothing of its carrying quality and gained something else, a frequency that was not threatening, because it was past threatening, because threatening implies a possibility that the thing won't happen, and this did not imply that possibility at all. He said, "Take your cars and your people and go back to whatever part of this town you still have left and don't come back." Sarah had reached the front doors. She pushed through them without looking back, and the warmth of the building came around her like something deliberate. The main hallway of Rust Creek High was crowded with the ordinary morning press of students moving toward lockers and homerooms, and the noise of it was the noise she knew: voices and sneakers and the metallic percussion of locker doors, and it stopped when she walked in. Not all at once. In a wave, the same way the engines had cut in the parking lot, awareness moving through the space from the point of her entry, outward students turning conversations, halting the particular silence of several hundred young people who have all simultaneously registered that something is different. She walked down the main corridor. Behind her, through the glass doors, she was aware of the sound of engines starting, not 90 but several. A smaller sound, the sound of the Tahoe and the sedans leaving. She did not turn around to confirm this. She kept walking. Cole came through the doors behind her with 20 riders in formation, their boots on the linoleum creating that rhythmic, heavy percussion that she had heard first in a hospital corridor, and that she now associated permanently and without ambiguity with the specific sound of people who had decided to do something and were doing it. Principal Garrett was in the hallway outside the main office, holding a clipboard, wearing the expression of a man who has been waiting anxiously for something and has now discovered that what arrived is considerably larger than he prepared for. He was a thin man, Garrett, with the perpetually worried look of someone who has built a career on not making decisions that could come back to him. And he stepped into the corridor with the uncertain authority of a person who knows they are supposed to be in charge and is not currently sure what that means. He said Sarah's name. He said it twice. His eyes moved from her face to the riders behind her and back to her face. Cole stopped beside her. He looked at Garrett with the measuring quality he brought to everything, the assessment of a man who reads the substance of people quickly and without ceremony. He told Garrett that 2 weeks ago one of his teachers had nearly been beaten to death in the service alley behind the school's east wing while attempting to protect a student. He said this not as accusation, though it was accusation, but as recitation of established fact, the way you cite a record that exists and is not in dispute. He said that in the 2 weeks since that event, Principal Garrett had made exactly one phone call to that teacher, which had lasted 4 minutes and had contained no offer of specific support, no inquiry into the nature of the threat she was still facing, and no acknowledgement that the school had any responsibility toward a staff member who had been assaulted on school property while performing her professional duties. Garrett began to say something. Cole said, "I'm not finished." Garrett stopped. Cole said that going forward, the school operated under a simple set of conditions. No student in this building would be approached, threatened, followed, or touched by anyone affiliated with any street organization. If a student reported to any teacher or staff member that they were being intimidated by outside parties, the teacher or staff member would call the number that Rourke, currently standing outside the front entrance, would provide to the main office before leaving this morning. They would not call the precinct. They would call that number. He said that the faculty parking lot, the front entrance, and the service alley behind the East Wing were effective immediately under the observation of club members whose schedule and rotation would not be shared with the administration. He said that Ms. Calloway had her classroom for as long as she wanted it at the salary she deserved, with the resources her students required, and that if Garrett found either of those conditions difficult to meet, Cole would find the conversation about why that was the case to be very interesting. Garrett was nodding before Cole finished the sentence. He was nodding with the comprehensive, unconditional agreement of a man who has just had the coordinates of the situation made very clear to him. Cole said, "Good." He looked at Sarah. He said, "Lead the way." She walked down the east corridor, past the rows of lockers, past the water fountain, past the bulletin board with its curling announcements, and the fire safety poster she had walked past every day for 6 years. The students pressed back against the walls as they passed, not in fear, not exactly, but with the instinctive respect that large and serious things command from those who are old enough to recognize their scale and young enough to not yet have learned to pretend they don't. She turned the corner into the East Wing. Room 204. The door was open. Leo Hargrove was standing inside. He was leaning against the front row of desks with his arms crossed and his chin up in the denim jacket with its frayed cuffs. And he looked in this moment nothing like the boy who had spent 6 weeks lingering in her classroom for 20 minutes after every bell, waiting for the halls to empty, because what was waiting for him outside was a man with a knife and a message, and no concern whatsoever for the cost of delivering it. He looked like someone who had arrived somewhere, rather than someone who was always trying to find a way to leave. His eyes went to his father first, then they came to Sarah and they took in the stitches on her jaw, and the fading bruise on her cheek, and the oversized leather cut with its white stitching over her wool cardigan, and something in his face that had been held at a particular tension for a very long time, released. He did not cry. He was 14 and he was Cole Hargrove's son, and he did not cry. But his eyes were bright and his jaw was working, and Sarah had been teaching long enough to know what it costs a young person to maintain composure when the thing they are feeling is very large. Cole walked past her into the room. He crossed to his son, and he put both hands on the boy's shoulders and looked at him for a moment, and then he pulled him in. The hug was not demonstrative. It was not performed for anyone watching. It was simply complete the way that some things are simply complete. His massive arms around the boy's thin shoulders, Leo's face pressed into the leather of his father's cut. The two of them in the particular stillness of people who have been very frightened and have now at last been allowed to be somewhere safe. Sarah stood in the doorway of her classroom. She did not go in. This was not her moment to be in the room for. She stood at the threshold and she let the tears come, without doing anything about them, not performing them, and not suppressing them, just letting them be what they were. The body's honest accounting of what the last 2 weeks had cost and what this moment was worth. Rourke appeared beside her in the corridor, silent as always, and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man who is finding the fluorescent lighting fixtures extremely interesting. Cole released Leo. He stepped back and held the boy at arm's length for a moment and said something too low to hear. Leo nodded. Cole turned toward the door. He looked at Sarah. He said, "We'll be outside. Rourke and Carver in the front lot through the end of the semester. Anything happens that you don't like the look of, you call." She said, "Thank you, Cole." He said no. He said it in the way that means the debt is the other way, the way that means the accounting has already been done and the numbers are settled. He walked out and the 20 riders in the corridor fell in behind him, and the sound of their boots faded down the east wing and out through the main entrance in the parking lot outside, absorbed them. Sarah dried her face with the back of her hand. She squared her shoulders. She walked into room 204 and put her satchel on her desk and took off her coat, but she left the leather cut on and she took the banded stack of papers from the front pocket of the satchel and set them on the corner of the desk. Leo was back at his seat, the back left corner where he had always sat. He had his notebook open. He was not drawing. He was looking at her. She said, "You still owe me an essay on the causes of industrialization in post-Civil War America." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "I want it by Friday. No extensions. You've had 2 weeks." He said, "I know." She said, "Good." She picked up a piece of chalk and turned to the board, and the morning bell rang and she heard the corridor outside fill with the sound of students moving, and she heard the classroom door begin to collect them, the scrape of chairs and the drop of backpacks, the particular orchestral noise of 30 young people settling into the space where they were supposed to be. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She began to write on the board. Winter came to Russ Creek with the specific severity of winters in that part of Pennsylvania, hard and long and without apology. The ground froze in December and did not meaningfully thaw until late March, and the gray skies that had been a permanent atmospheric feature of the town for as long as anyone had been paying attention pressed down low and heavy for months. Inside Russ Creek High, the atmosphere was different than it had been. The change was not dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, the way light changes in a room when you open a window that's been painted shut for years. The students from the South Side, the ones who had walked with their eyes down and their shoulders forward and their presence compressed into the smallest possible signature, began slowly and then more rapidly to take up the space that was theirs. The low-level commerce that had operated in the East Stairwell for 2 years simply ceased, the individuals involved having made the pragmatic calculation that whatever they had been gaining from that arrangement was no longer worth what it might cost. Rourke's bike in the front lot every morning became within 3 weeks unremarkable, the way anything that is consistently present becomes unremarkable. The students stopped staring. Some of them nodded. One junior, a kid named Taft, who was failing pre-calculus and had a complicated home situation that Sarah knew pieces of, started bringing 2 cups of coffee from the gas station on the corner every morning and leaving one on the ground beside Rourke's bike without saying anything about it, and Rourke accepted this arrangement without comment, and Taft's pre-calculus grade, perhaps unrelatedly, began to improve. Leo Hargrove turned in the essay on industrialization on a Thursday, which was technically a day late, and Sarah gave him full credit because the essay was 9 pages long and demonstrated a command of economic causation in historical context that was frankly better than most college freshmen managed. She kept it. She put it in a folder in her desk drawer. She was going to need it later for a different purpose. In January, it rained for 11 days in a row. That particular late winter mid-Atlantic rain that is too cold to be refreshing and too steady to ignore. Sarah drove to school through it and graded papers through it and had 2 conferences with college advisors through it, and she was home on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of January, sitting at her kitchen table with a stack of junior theme essays and a glass of water and the particular focused quiet that comes when the work in front of you requires your full attention and you are, for the moment, able to give it. The knock at her door came at 11:17. It was not Rourke's knock. She knew Rourke's knock by now, the specific pattern of it. This was different, faster, less certain of itself. She went to the door and looked through the side window before she opened it. Voss. He looked like a man who had aged significantly in the 2 months since she had last seen him standing in her hospital room with a toothpick and a closed notepad. The professional composure that had been so infuriating in that room was gone, replaced by something exposed and raw. The look of a man who has been inside a structure that he believed was solid and has recently discovered that it is not. His trench coat was wet from the rain, and he was holding a cigarette that had gone out. He was standing on her porch with the specific posture of someone who has been rehearsing an approach and is no longer confident in it. She opened the door but did not unlock the storm door. She said, "It's late, detective." He said, "I need 5 minutes. I need you to listen to me for 5 minutes." She said, "I'm listening." He said that there was a federal agent named Mercer out of the Pittsburgh field office who had been in Rust Creek for the past 3 weeks conducting an audit of precinct records going back 10 years. He said this Mercer was methodical and thorough and had already identified several significant irregularities in the filing and documentation of certain cases over the past 5 years. He said that among the documentation Mercer had requested was the incident report from the night of her assault, and that the absence of a formal victim statement in that file was something Mercer had flagged specifically. His voice was doing something effortful, maintaining a steadiness it did not naturally have. He said, I need you to sign an amendment to the incident report. I needed to reflect that the assailants were masked, that you were unable to identify any of them, that I conducted a proper intake interview and followed standard procedure throughout. If you sign that the irregularity disappears and Mercer moves on. He stopped. He looked at her through the storm door with an expression that contained in its complicated layers something almost indistinguishable from a plea. He said, I know I don't have any standing to ask you this. I know that. But if this investigation goes where it's going, I am finished. I'm not just talking about my job. People in federal custody, with my history, with the specific nature of what Mercer is going to find, the things that happen to people like that don't leave a lot of room for outcome. The rain came down steadily on the porch roof. Sarah looked at the man on the other side of the storm door, the man who had sat in the plastic chair beside her hospital bed, and told her to forget the face of the man who had put her there and be grateful for the advice. She thought about the particular quality of that conversation, the patience of it, the assumption embedded in it that she would accept what she was offered, because what was she going to do about it? She opened her mouth to respond. A voice from the darkness of the yard said, I think that's enough, David. Voss spun. His hand went to his hip to the service weapon holstered there, and then stopped because the voice that had come from the darkness carried in it something that made the calculation of drawing a weapon feel suddenly and completely wrong. Cole Hargrove stepped out of the shadow of the oak tree at the corner of the front yard. He was in the rain unhurried, his dark thermal shirt darkening further with the moisture his hands at his sides. He came up the front walk with the same quality of motion he always had, the deliberate economical movement of someone who has never needed to be in a hurry because the room, or in this case the yard, was already organized around his presence. He came up the porch steps and stood beside the storm door. He was a great deal taller than Voss, and he did not use this difference aggressively, did not lean into it or position himself to emphasize it, but it was simply present as physical facts are present. He said, you can take your hand off your hip, detective. The only person getting hurt on this porch tonight is your career, and that's already done. Voss's hand moved away from his holster. He looked at Cole with the expression of a man who has opened a door expecting a room and found the outside. Cole said, here is what Agent Mercer found on his desk 9 days ago. An anonymous package. Inside that package were the original copies of ledger records maintained by the Kane distribution operation for the past 4 years. Those records document 18 months of payments to 6 members of the Rust Creek precinct, including one detective, David Voss, in exchange for specific operational accommodations. The records include dates, amounts, and in several cases, the specific cases those payments were made to influence. He said this in the same tone he used for everything level, unhurried, factual. He said one of the cases documented in those records is the assault on Ms. Calloway in November. There is a specific entry dated the morning after that references the payment made to ensure no formal statement was taken and no suspect identification was pursued. The entry is in handwriting that forensic document analysis will be able to attribute without significant difficulty. Voss had gone the color of the wall behind him. Cole said, I sent the package. I want you to know that. I want you to be clear that it was a choice I made deliberately, not something that happened to you, but something that was done to you intentionally by me. Because what you did in that hospital room was a specific kind of cowardice that I find it difficult to sit with. He said you left a woman who had taken boots to the ribs and the face protecting a child to deal with the consequences of that alone, because it was easier for you than doing your job. You sat beside her in a hospital bed, and you used the authority of your office to pressure her into silence, and then you went home and you went to sleep. I would like you to understand that I have been thinking about that since November, and my opinion of it has not softened. The rain continued. Somewhere down the street a car passed. Cole said, and now his voice was very quiet, get off this porch. Go home. Be there in the morning when Mercer comes, because he's coming in the morning, and you running will not improve anything for you. I am telling you this not as a courtesy, but because I want you to be there when the accounting happens. I want it to be formal and documented, and I want there to be a record of it." Voss stepped off the porch. He did it without speaking, without any of the residual authority he had carried in the hospital, without anything that resembled the detective who had toothpicked his way through a conversation about her safety and suggested she be grateful. He walked to his car and got in, and the car moved away down the wet street and around the corner and was gone. Cole stood on her porch in the rain. Sarah unlocked the storm door and pushed it open. She said, "Is it over?" He said the criminal part. He paused. "Mercer is good at his job. By the end of next week, most of what the Canes built in this town will be in federal hands. Voss and the others will be processed. The distribution network is already gone. It fell apart when Derek left. These things don't survive the departure of the person running them." He said, "It's over, Sarah." She leaned against the doorframe and looked at the rain falling on Maple Street, on the maple trees stripped bare on the frozen front lawns, on a town that had been bleeding out for 20 years and had spent the last 2 months quietly and without announcement beginning to stop. She said, "How did you get the ledgers?" He said, "Derek left things behind when he ran. People who run in a hurry leave things behind. We found the stash house on the South Canal Road inside of 48 hours. He said, "I've been many things in my life, Sarah. I am not going to stand on your porch and tell you otherwise, or ask you to think better of my history than the record warrants. But I have a son, and my son is alive and unhurt because of what you did in that alley. The ledgers were the least of what I owed you." She looked at him. She said, "Thank you, Cole." He said it again, the same as before, "No." He stepped off the porch. He walked down the front path and out the gate, and the truck was there, idling at the curb where she hadn't noticed it. And he got in, and the truck pulled away, and Sarah stood in the open doorway until the taillights turned the corner and disappeared. She went back to her kitchen table and looked at the stack of essays and the glass of water and the ordinary components of a Tuesday night that had resumed its ordinary character. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She thought about what Cole had said and what she had said, and the particular weight of it being over the way something you've been braced against lifting creates its own specific feeling in the muscles, a strange, disoriented looseness where the pressure was. Then she picked up the top essay and began to read. 3.5 years is a long time in a place that is changing. Rust Creek changed, not dramatically, not in the way of sudden revitalization narratives, not with new storefronts opening overnight, or a developer arriving to convert the old Harwell plant into luxury lofts. It changed the way things change when a sustained systemic pressure is removed slowly by degrees, with reversals and complications in the particular 2 steps forward quality of places that have been damaged deeply and are healing from the inside. The precinct acquired new leadership by March. Agent Mercer's audit resulted in federal charges against 4 officers and the quiet resignation of 6 more. The new chief was a woman from Allentown who had a reputation for being difficult to influence and easy to read, and within 6 months of her arrival, 3 cold cases from the preceding 5 years had been reopened, and 2 of them had resulted in arrests. The South Side, without the Kane Network's interference in its economic life, began to stabilize in the modest, unglamorous way that neighborhoods stabilize when the thing that was extracting from them is removed. A hardware store opened on Clement Street, a real one with actual hardware. The diner on the main road changed hands for the 5th time, but this time to a couple from Pittsburgh who knew how to run a diner. And for the first time in a decade, there was a place in Rust Creek where you could get a meal that was both good and affordable, and the tables were full on Saturday mornings. Leo Hargrove turned in every assignment from January of freshman year through the spring of senior year. Every one. He never turned in anything on time. This became an acknowledged and negotiated condition of their arrangement, but the work when it arrived was always worth the wait. The essay on post-war industrial economics that Sarah had put in the folder in her desk drawer became a writing sample for his Penn State application. The application was accompanied by a portfolio of technical drawings that the Mechanical Engineering Department's admissions committee later described in correspondence with Rust Creek High as among the most sophisticated they had seen from an applicant of any age. Sarah became head of the English department in the fall of the 2nd year. She reordered the junior curriculum to include a unit on American labor history that she built around primary sources, testimonies from steelworkers and miners and factory workers across the 20th century, voices from places like Rust Creek that had given everything they had to the making of a country and then been left to manage their own diminishment as best they could. Her students, who were the children and grandchildren of those steel workers and miners and factory workers, read these testimonies with a recognition that no other text had produced in them, and several of them wrote responses that Sarah considered among the best work she had seen in 6 years of teaching. The leather cut with its white stitching, the one she had worn over her cardigan on a Thursday morning in November, hung in a shadow box on the wall behind her desk. It had been framed by a retired woodworker in the South Side, who had done it as a gift, who had told her when he brought it in that his granddaughter was in her sophomore English class, and that whatever she was doing in that classroom, she should keep doing it. Sarah thanked him. She put the frame on the wall. It stayed there. Students asked about it. She told them. She told the story without drama, without the performance of heroism, simply as a sequence of events in which people made choices, and those choices had consequences, some of which were painful and some of which were very good, and most of which were both. It became over 3 years one of the foundational stories of Rust Creek High, the kind of story that accumulates detail and meaning as it passes from class to class, that becomes not just a story about what happened, but a story about what the place believes in. The June of Leo Hargrove's senior year came in warm and clear, the kind of late spring day that Pennsylvania offers as apology for its winters, the sky a solid and unambiguous blue, the air carrying the smell of cut grass from the football field, where the maintenance crew had been working since 7 that morning, setting up for the ceremony. Sarah sat in the faculty row in her commencement regalia, the gown heavy in the June heat, watching the football field fill with the organized chaos of graduating seniors finding their seats. She looked for Leo in the alphabetical procession and found him near the middle of the formation, taller than she remembered, and then immediately recognized as absurd. She had seen him 3 days ago. He had not grown since Thursday, but there was something about seeing him in the gown and the flat mortarboard, his dark hair long as always visible beneath it, that made him look different from the version of him she carried in daily memory. Older, more fully arrived. She turned in her seat as she always turned and looked toward the back of the bleachers. They were there. Cole at the center, and on either side of him, Rourke and Carver, and faces she knew and faces she didn't. 20 men in leather sitting in the top row of the bleachers with the patient upright stillness of people who are taking something seriously. No engines, no formation. Just men who had driven to a high school graduation on a Friday morning in June because a boy they knew was crossing a stage, and that was a thing worth witnessing. Cole caught her eye across the field. He gave her the nod she had come to understand as his fullest expression of warmth, the slow, deliberate acknowledgement that meant, I see you and I am here, and these things are connected. She returned it. The ceremony ran its customary length. The principal's address, the salutatory, the processional of names. Sarah watched each of her students cross the stage with the particular accumulative feeling she had every year at graduation, the simultaneous pride and release, and the underlying knowledge which never became easier that she was sending them into a world she could no longer be between them and Leo Michael Hargrove. The applause from the assembled families was warm and generous in the way that applause for any name is warm and generous at a high school graduation. The sound of people who are glad to be there and glad for anyone crossing that stage. And then from the top row of the bleachers, a different sound, fuller and more specific, a deep collective sound that made the parents in the vicinity startle and turn, and then seeing the source of it, not quite know how to respond. Leo walked across the stage. He shook the principal's hand. He accepted his diploma. He turned to walk to the far stairs. He stopped. He turned back to the microphone, and the principal, who was already turning to the next name on the list, paused, and Leo stepped to the stand and adjusted the microphone downward to his height, and the football field went by degrees quiet. He looked at the faculty row. He said, I only need a minute. His voice through the PA system was steady, a little rougher than usual, the roughness of emotion being managed rather than suppressed. He said, 4 years ago, I didn't believe I was going to live to be 18. I am not being dramatic about this. I mean it as a statement of how I understood probability at the time. I thought the world was a place that sorted people early, that decided what you were worth before you had any say in it, and that once it had decided that was what you were. He said I was wrong about that, but I didn't know I was wrong until someone showed me. He looked at Sarah. He said Ms. Calloway walked into something she didn't have to walk into. She walked in without a weapon and without backup and without any realistic expectation that it was going to go well for her because a kid she barely knew needed someone to stand in front of him, and she was the person who was there. That's all. She was the person who was there, and she decided that was enough of a reason. He said she taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. She taught me that every time I watched her walk into the school and write on that board and hand back papers and do the ordinary work of her job in the months after that night, when it would have been completely reasonable to have left when no one would have blamed her for leaving. She stayed because the work mattered, because we mattered, because she had decided a long time ago that this was what she was for. His voice did something briefly, and he stopped for a moment. He said, "Dad." He looked up at the bleachers. He held the diploma up, a single clean gesture, simple and complete. "You stood in front of us both. I know what that cost, and I know what it means. I'll spend my life being worth it." The football field was entirely silent for a moment. Then the sound started, not in the faculty row and not in the bleachers, but everywhere simultaneously, the sound of people who have heard something true and are responding to it in the only way available to them. And it built and built until it was a full, unambiguous standing ovation. Parents getting to their feet, teachers getting to their feet, and from the top of the bleachers, 20 men in leather rising without self-consciousness, to their feet clapping with their large, scarred, ring-heavy hands, and Cole Hargrove standing among them with his chin up and his jaw set, and something in his eyes that he would never have named in a room full of people and did not need to. Leo stepped back from the microphone. He walked to the stairs. He disappeared into the graduating class arranged on the infield. Sarah sat in the faculty row and did not try to stop what was happening on her face. She let it happen. She let it all happen, the years of it, the morning in the alley and the hospital and Maple Street and the parking lot and the kitchen table and the 10 days of Rourke on her porch and the drawing left under the doormat and everything that came after all of it, moving through her at once, not in any organized way, but the way things move through you when you finally allow them to all at once and without apology. After the ceremony, the field dissolved into the joyful confusion of families finding each other photographs and embraces, and the particular chaotic happiness of an ending that is also a beginning. Sarah was moving through this, accepting the congratulations of colleagues and the quick, awkward hugs of students whose composition she had bled over when she heard her name. Leo was walking toward her, the gown unzipped, his mortarboard in his hand, taller than she'd thought on the stage. Beside him, Cole, who moved through the crowd the way he moved through everything in his own space, unhurried. She said, "Penn State's mechanical engineering program has no idea what's about to happen to it." Leo laughed, and it was a real laugh, full and unguarded, the laugh of someone who has forgotten to be careful for a moment and doesn't miss the caution at all. He reached into the pocket of his dress shirt and produced something that he held out toward her in his palm. It was a gear. Custom machined, the steel polished to a warm silver gleam, the teeth cut with perfect precision. Small enough to hold in one hand, heavy enough to feel like something that meant what it was. And engraved into the flat face of it, in letters that matched exactly the cramped, precise hand she had come to know from the margins of a spiral notebook, to the engine that kept me running. She said, "Leo." He said, "I machined it in April. It took 6 tries to get the engraving even." She closed her hand around it. The metal was warm from his pocket, and it was solid, and it was the most specific and perfect thing she could imagine, the language of precision and care and work. The language he had been developing his whole life, before he had the words for what he meant. Cole extended his hand. She took it, felt the familiar, calloused warmth of it, the weight of those scarred fingers. He said, "You did good, Sarah." She said he did the work. Cole said he had somewhere to do it. They stood for a moment on the June grass of the football field of Russ Creek High School, the three of them, while the celebration moved around them, and the blue sky held its position above the town that had been slowly dying for 20 years and had decided somewhere in the long, difficult course of things to try something else instead. Then Leo said he had to find his friends, and Cole said he had to get back, and they walked away toward the row of motorcycles waiting in the parking lot. Cole's hand briefly on the back of Leo's neck, and she watched them go. She stood on the field for a while after they had gone. She opened her hand and looked at the gear in her palm. She looked at the engraving. She thought about engines, about the things that keep running and the things that make them run, about the unlikely sources of the energy that moves us forward when everything argues for stopping. Then she walked back inside through the corridors she had walked every day for 6 years, past the lockers, in the water fountain, in the bulletin board, past the fire safety poster into room 204. She put her bag on her desk. She took off the graduation gown and hung it on the back of the door. She went to the shadow box on the wall and looked at the leather cut behind the glass, the white stitching, that single word. She put the gear on her desk beside the pencil cup and the granola bar jar, in a place where it would catch the afternoon light when it came through the west windows. She sat down. Outside, the parking lot was filling with the sound of motorcycles starting, the familiar low thunder moving away through the June afternoon, growing quieter by degrees until it was part of the distance, and then not even that. Just the ordinary sound of a June afternoon in a town that had found its way to something that wasn't quite healed but was honestly and without exaggeration getting there. She picked up a pen. There were essays to mark.